Sterling Vane stood in the freezing rain, watching the lights of his global empire flicker and die, while Dominique St. Clair sat in his velvet chair, signing the deed to everything he ever loved. He thought she was just a ghost in the archives, a low-level researcher with no pedigree. He laughed while he built his factories on her family's blood. He didn't realize he was building his own casket. Dominique St. Clair slowly twisted her silver dragon scale ring. She wasn't seeking a confession. She was seeking a clouded title reversion. Sterling made one fatal error. He forgot that every legacy has a rightful owner. And today, he is just a squatter. In the next few minutes, you will witness the total erasure of a billionaire. This is a masterclass in forensic justice. Pay close attention to the paper trail, because by the end of this story, you will know exactly how to reclaim what was stolen. The air inside the grand ballroom of the Vane estate did not just smell of wealth. It smelled of history, of ancient wood polish, of imported lilies, and of the suffocating arrogance of men who believe they have purchased time itself. Outside, a relentless rain hammered against the reinforced glass of the skyscraper, a storm that seemed determined to wash away the sins of the city. But inside, the atmosphere was a warm, golden lie. Sterling Vane stood at the center of it all. His face was a mask of calculated triumph. 50 years of dominance. 50 years of controlling the lifeblood of this city. The water. The power. The very ground upon which these people stood. He raised a crystal flute of vintage champagne. The light caught the bubbles. Millions of tiny explosions trapped in glass, just like the lives of the people he had crushed to build this monument to himself. Then the heavy oak doors at the far end of the hall groaned. They did not open with a crash. They opened with the slow, deliberate weight of a vault being unsealed. The string quartet faltered. The collective breath of 300 elite guests caught in their throats. The temperature in the room did not just drop. It plummeted. It was the kind of cold that starts in the bone marrow and works its way out. Dominique St. Clair stepped into the light. She did not walk like a guest. She walked like a predator returning to a territory that had been temporarily occupied by scavengers. Her skin was a deep, flawless obsidian. It seemed to absorb the frantic golden light of the chandeliers, making her look like a silhouette cut out of the night sky itself. And then there was the contrast. A floor-length ponytail of platinum blonde hair. It trailed behind her like a frozen river. Sharp, electric line of defiance against the dark elegance of her attire. She wore a gown of liquid midnight. It draped over her frame with the precision of a military uniform. Her jawline was a razor, a masterpiece of genetic architecture that suggested she was not here to negotiate. She was here to preside. Dominique did not look at the guests. She did not seek approval from the men in their $5,000 tuxedos. She looked straight through the crowd, straight at Sterling Vane. As she moved, her right hand rose. Her thumb found the silver dragon scale ring. It was a heavy, intricate piece of jewelry. The scales seemed to ripple as the light hit them, silver reflecting the cold fire of her intent. She began to twist it. Click, click, click. The sound was faint, but in the sudden silence of the ballroom, it sounded like the ticking of a countdown, a rhythmic reminder that every second Sterling Vane spent on that podium was a second he was stealing from the rightful owner. Dominique reached the edge of the dance floor. She stopped. The space between her and the villain felt like a physical barrier, a vacuum where no sound could exist. Sterling Vane lowered his glass. His eyes narrowed. He looked for the fear he was used to seeing in the eyes of his subordinates. He looked for the hesitation of a common intruder. He found neither. In the eyes of Dominique St. Clair, he found only the cold, analytical gaze of a forensic genealogist who had spent years digging through the filth of his family tree. He didn't know her name yet. He didn't know that she had spent the last decade tracking the flow of every cent he had ever made. He didn't know that she had found the ghost trust, the one document his grandfather thought he had burned in 1904. Dominique twisted the dragon scale ring again. Her thumb felt the sharp edge of each scale. It was a tactile anchor, a reminder of the weight of the legacy she carried. She looked at the walls, at the ornate moldings, at the sprawling map of the city's infrastructure that hung behind the bar to the guests. It was a map of power. To Dominique, it was a map of stolen property. She knew the exact coordinates of the primary water main. She knew the depth of the power lines that fed the financial district. And she knew that the deed to the land beneath them was not held by Bain Industries. It was held by a trust that had been dormant for a century. A trust that had finally found its voice. Dominique took a single step forward. The sound of her heel against the marble floor echoed like a gunshot. The silence was no longer awkward. It was terrifying. Sterling Vane cleared his throat. The sound was dry, grating, like sandpaper on silk. He tried to reclaim the room. He tried to remember that he was the king of this concrete jungle. Who invited you? He asked. His voice was projected, formidable, but there was a tremor in the way. He gripped his glass. Dominique did not answer immediately. She let the question hang in the air until it felt small, pathetic. She twisted the ring one final time. A sharp, decisive motion. "I didn't need an invitation, Sterling," she said. Her voice was low, like the hum of a high-voltage wire. "I am the landlord, and your lease has just expired." The room seemed to tilt. The elite of the city looked at each other, confused. They looked for the joke. But Dominique St. Clair was not a woman who told jokes. She was a woman who dealt in facts, in fiduciary duty, in the cold, hard reality of title law. She reached into her small, beaded clutch. Her movements were slow, fluid. She pulled out a single, folded piece of parchment. It looked ancient. The edges were brittle. The ink was faded, but the seal at the bottom was unmistakable. It was the seal of the original land grant, a document that predated the city itself, a document that proved the Sterling family had been building their empire on a foundation of sand. Dominique held the paper up, not for the crowd to see, but for Sterling to recognize. She watched the color drain from his face. She watched his hand begin to shake. She saw the moment he realized that his 50 years of dominance were about to be reduced to 50 years of back rent. This was not a social visit. This was a seizure. The string quartet had completely stopped now. The only sound was the rain outside, and the slow, rhythmic twisting of the silver dragon scale ring. Dominique felt the pulse in her thumb. Steady, calm, she was not angry. Anger was for the weak. Anger was for those who did not have the law on their side. She felt the immense weight of the silver against her skin. It was the weight of justice. The weight of every ancestor who had been erased so that men like Sterling could have their names on buildings. She looked around the room one last time, at the faces of the people who had benefited from the theft, the lawyers, the bankers, the socialites. In 60 minutes. They would all be looking for the exit. In 60 minutes. The lights in this ballroom would not belong to Sterling Vane. They would belong to the St. Clair. Trust. Dominique took a deep breath. The scent of the lily was fading, replaced by the sharp, metallic smell of an approaching storm. She turned her gaze back to the villain. He was trying to speak. His mouth was moving, but no words were coming out. The arrogance was gone, replaced by the raw, primal fear of a man who has just realized he is standing on a trapdoor. And Dominique St. Clair was the only one with the key. She didn't need to shout. She didn't need to make a scene. The silence she brought with her was more powerful than any weapon. She waited for him to break. She waited for the moment his knees would give way. She was a forensic genealogist. She knew how to wait. She had waited 100 years for this moment. Another few minutes was nothing. The room was cold. The air was heavy, and the dragon scale ring was glowing under the spotlight. The game was over. The audit had begun. The silence in the grand ballroom was no longer a void. It was a weapon. Dominique St. Clair stood at the epicenter of the stillness. Her floor-length platinum blonde ponytail rested against the deep obsidian of her shoulder. A silver streak of lightning against a night sky. Every eye in the room was anchored to her, including the predatory gaze of Sterling Vane. Sterling forced a laugh. It was a hollow sound, like dry leaves skittering across a tombstone. He looked around at his guests, searching for the comfort of their shared arrogance. He found only confusion. Dominique did not move. She did not blink. She simply waited. Her right thumb found the silver dragon scale. Ring, she began to rotate it, slowly, methodically. The intricate metalwork caught the flicker of the $1,000 candles, sending jagged shards of light across the marble floor. A waiter approached. His hands were visibly trembling. He offered a silver tray laden with crystal flutes. Dominique reached out. Her fingers, long and elegant, wrapped around the stem of a glass. She did not take a sip. She held the liquid up to the light. The amber champagne looked like liquid gold. Stolen gold. Sterling Vane stepped down from the podium. His polished leather shoes clicked with a hollow resonance. He was trying to regain his territory. He was trying to remind the room that he was the architect of. I have meticulously cleaned and formatted this script for the CapCut Mary voiceover. I have removed all image tags, currency symbols, and technical abbreviations that cause the AI to stutter or mispronounce words. The story remains exactly the same, but the formatting now ensures a smooth, cinematic delivery. Their prosperity. You have a flair for the dramatic, Dominique, he said. His voice was a practiced baritone, but the edges were fraying. Is this a performance? Or did you simply lose your way to the archives? The guests chuckled, a nervous, rippling sound. They wanted to believe him. They wanted to believe that this woman was an anomaly, a temporary glitch in their gilded reality. Dominique raised the glass higher. She did not look at the guests. She looked at the reflection of the ballroom in the crystal, a distorted world of greed and overconsumption. I didn't lose my way, Sterling, I found it, she said, her voice carried without effort. It had the weight of a judicial sentence. I found the path you tried to bury under 50 years of industrial waste and forged signatures. She turned her body. The platinum hair followed her like a royal train. She faced the crowd. These were the men and women who controlled the city's pulse, the bankers who approved the loans, the judges who looked the other way, the architects who built monuments to theft. A toast, Dominique announced. Her words cut through the remaining murmurs like a scalpel. She took a step toward the center of the room. The silver dragon scale ring hummed against her skin, a tactile reminder of the blood equity she was here to claim. To the empires built in the dark, she began. To the legacies that were not earned, but stolen. To the names etched in marble that belong in the mud. And to the truth that can no longer be silenced by a checkbook. The room went ice cold. The champagne in the glasses seemed to freeze. Dominique's eyes locked onto Sterling Vane's lead counsel, Marcus Thorne. Marcus was a man who had spent 40 years navigating the gray areas of international law. He was a master of the loophole, a weaver of corporate shadows. But as Dominique spoke, the color vanished from his face. He wasn't looking at Dominique's face. He was looking at the ancient parchment she still held in her left hand. Marcus knew that seal. He had seen it once in a restricted archive in London. It was the seal of the St. Clair ancestral land grant, a document that carried the weight of sovereign deed, a document that could nullify every contract Sterling Vane had signed in the last 5 decades. Sterling let out a loud, barking laugh. He threw his head back, acting for the benefit of his shareholders' stolen legacies. He shouted, toasting the air with his own glass. My family built this city. We laid the pipes. We strung the wires. We turned the lights on when everyone else was afraid of the dark. If that's theft, then the world belongs to the bold. He took a deep drink, swallowing the arrogance like a tonic. The guests began to join him, relieved that the tension had been broken by a joke. They raised their glasses, celebrating their own safety. But Dominique's gaze never left. Marcus Thorne, she watched the lead counsel lean in toward Sterling. His hand was on Sterling's sleeve. a gesture of desperate urgency. Marcus whispered something into Sterling's ear. The billionaire's laugh died. Mid-breath. Dominique twisted the silver dragon scale ring. Click. She felt the trap jaw snap shut. She saw the exact moment the seed of doubt took root in Sterling's mind. It wasn't a large crack, just a hairline fracture in his confidence. But in a structure this heavy, a hairline fracture is the beginning of a collapse. You think you own the water, Sterling? Dominique said. Her voice was a low vibration. But you forgot that you don't own the ground it flows through. You think you own the power? But you forgot who owns the easement. She tilted her glass. Slowly, the expensive champagne poured out, splashing onto the white marble, a golden stain spreading at the feet of the elite. This isn't a toast to your success. She continued. This is a formal notice of adverse possession. Every building you own, every factory you run, every cent you have collected in rent. It is now a debt to the St. Clair Trust, and I am here to collect. Sterling's face turned a violent shade of crimson. The mask of the statesman was gone. The raw, ugly face of the industrialist remained. You're insane, he hissed. Security? Get this woman out of my house. Dominique didn't move. She didn't have to. From the back of the room, 3 men in charcoal suits stepped forward. They didn't look like bouncers. They looked like federal agents, because they were. Dominique looked at Marcus Thorne. The lawyer had already set his glass down. His hands were behind his back. He knew the protocol. He knew that when a sovereign deed is presented, no security guard in the world has the authority to intervene. It's not your house, Sterling, Dominique whispered. Her voice was the only thing audible over the sound of the rain. It never was. You were just a ghost manager for a trust you didn't understand. She reached out and touched the silver dragon scale ring one last time. The metal felt warm now, charged with the energy of a century of waiting. Dominique turned her back on the villain. She began to walk toward the exit. The crowd parted for her like the Red Sea. They didn't see a researcher anymore. They saw the executioner. As she reached the doors, she paused. She didn't look back, Marcus. She called out. The lead counsel looked up. His eyes were wide with the terror that only a lawyer can feel when they realize the law has turned against them. Make sure he reads Section 4 of the Perpetuity Clause. She said it would be a shame if he went to prison without knowing why. She stepped out into the night. The rain greeted her like an old friend. The platinum ponytail whipped in the wind, a banner of victory. Behind her, in the ballroom, the lights flickered. For the first time in 50 years, Sterling Vane was not in control of the power. Dominique St. Clair walked toward her waiting car. Her jawline was set in stone. The first seed of doubt had been planted, but she wasn't done. Planting a seed is easy now. She was going to watch the empire burn from the roots up. She felt the weight of the ring on her thumb. It was no longer a symbol of the past. It was the key to the future. A future where the disenfranchised didn't just ask for justice. They took it. The car door closed with a heavy, muffled thud, separating her from the dying world of Sterling Vane. Dominique looked out the window. At the city lights reflecting in the puddles. Tomorrow, the city would wake up to a new reality. The forensic audit was just beginning, and Dominique St. Clair had a long list of names to cross off. The glass penthouse sat 60 stories above the city, a transparent cage of luxury and cold calculation. Inside, the air smelled of expensive sandalwood and the sharp, metallic ozone of high-end servers. Dominique St. Clair sat at her mahogany desk, a surface so dark and polished it looked like a pool of oil. The only light came from the sprawling array of monitors. They cast a blue, ghostly glow across her deep obsidian skin, highlighting the razor-sharp line of her jaw. She was a silhouette of absolute focus. Her floor-length platinum ponytail was draped over the side of her chair. Shining like a blade in the dim light, Dominique was not looking at the news. She was not looking at social media. She was looking at a single, High-resolution scan of a document from 1924. She reached up with her right hand. Her thumb found the silver dragon scale ring. She didn't just touch it. She gripped it, feeling the sharp, individual scales bite into her skin. She began to twist it, click, click, click. The sound was the only thing that broke the silence of the room. It was the sound of a lie being unraveled. It was the sound of an empire beginning to leak its lifeblood for 10 years. Sterling Vane had told the world that Vane Tower was the indestructible heart of the city. He told the banks it was his primary collateral. He told the shareholders it was the ultimate symbol of their stability. He was wrong. Dominique leaned forward, her eyes reflecting the scrolling lines of code and legal text. She had found the crack. A ghost trust buried under 3 layers of shell companies and a century of fraudulent filings. An unresolved legal entity known as the St. Clair Ancestral Grant. It was a sovereign deed. A document that predated modern zoning laws. A document that stipulated the land could never be sold, only leased to those of direct blood descent. Sterling Vane was many things, but he was not a St. Clair. Dominique's thumb moved with deliberate precision. She hit the final key on her console. The release was not a shout. It was a whisper sent to the most powerful ears in the world, the Securities and Exchange Commission. The major news desks in London and New York, and the high-frequency trading algorithms that run the global markets. She uploaded the forensic audit, the original deed, and the proof that the Vane corporate headquarters sat on land that was legally unclaimed by its current occupants. The digital file was a grenade, and Dominique had just pulled the pin. She sat back, the leather of her chair groaned softly under the weight of her stillness. She watched the clock dot at 9 a.m. The markets opened at 9:05 a.m. The first red arrow appeared next to the ticker symbol V-N-E. At 9:15 a.m., the murmur began. Analysts on every major network were suddenly looking at their tablets with confusion. They used words like clouded title. They used phrases like systemic ownership risk. Dominique watched the numbers. $142 per share. $138 per share. She twisted the silver dragon scale ring again. The metal felt cold. But her screaming for his lawyers. He would be demanding that the leak be plugged. But you cannot plug a leak when the entire dam has been built on a lie. $130 per share. $125 per share. The drop was vertical. A 15% loss in less than an hour. Billions of dollars in market capitalization simply evaporated into the blue light of the morning. Dominique watched the wealth of the Vane family dissolve. It wasn't just money. It was the perception of power. In the world of high finance, perception is the only thing that keeps the lights on. Once people believe you are a squatter, you are no longer a king. She saw the breaking news banners flash across the bottom of the screens. Vane Industries faces unprecedented title dispute. Is the Vane empire built on a ghost trust? Dominique felt the vibration of her phone on the desk. It was Marcus Thorne, the lead counsel. He was calling, likely to beg or to threaten. She didn't answer. She let the phone vibrate until it went silent. Then she let it vibrate again. The silence of her penthouse was her greatest luxury. It was the silence of someone who already knows the ending of the book. She thought back to her childhood, to the shadow of the Vane factories that had loomed over her neighborhood like a hungry god. She remembered the smoke, the noise, the way the people there were treated like disposable parts in a machine they didn't own. Sterling Vane had spent 50 years extracting value from the disenfranchised. He had used their labor, their land, their lives. Dominique St. Clair was not here for an apology. She was here for a reclamation. She looked at her reflection in the dark monitor. The platinum ponytail looked like a halo of cold fire. Her skin was a map of survival and elite refinement. She reached out, and touched the screen, specifically the digital image of the Vane Tower. It looked so solid, so permanent. But Dominique knew the truth. Behind the steel and the glass, There was a void, a legal black hole that she had spent 10 years mapping. The ghost trust was not just a document. It was a ghost of the past that had finally come to claim its inheritance, $121 per share. The 15% threshold had been breached. Trading was halted, a temporary circuit breaker to prevent total collapse. But a circuit breaker cannot fix a broken foundation. Dominique stood up. Her movement was fluid, graceful like a dancer. She walked to the window and looked down at the city. Somewhere down there, Sterling Vane was realizing that his fortress was a cage. He was realizing that every signature he had ever made on a corporate contract was now under forensic review. The paper trail did not just lead to the building. It led to the crimes of his grandfather. It led to the secret banking protocols that had hidden the St. Clair fortune for a century. Dominique twisted the silver dragon scale ring one last time for the morning. A sharp final click. The lie had been exposed. The foundation was crumbling. She felt the heavy weight of the signature item against her thumb. It was a reminder that she was the only one who could navigate the wreckage she was creating. She wasn't just a researcher. She was a ghost hunter. And she had just found the primary spirit. She walked away from the window, leaving the city to its panic. She had more documents to leak, more worthless tax liens to activate. The stock price was just the beginning. Sterling Vane thought he was too big to fail. Dominique St. Clair was going to show him that the bigger the empire, the more room there is for the shadows to grow. She sat back down. The blue light washed over her once more. 1 hour. 15% by noon. She would take his heir. By midnight. She would take his soul. The audit was just getting started, and Dominique St. Clair never stopped until the books were balanced. The air in level B4 of the municipal parking garage was thick with the scent of damp concrete and stagnant exhaust. It was a cold, hollow space, situated deep beneath the heart of the city's financial district. Above, the world was screaming in financial agony. But down here, in the concrete bowels of the earth, there was only the sound of rhythmic dripping, water seeping through the fissures of a city. Built on a foundation of secrets, Dominique St. Clair stood perfectly still. She was a shadow within a shadow. Her deep obsidian skin was nearly indistinguishable from the gloom, save for the sharp, electric shimmer of her floor-length platinum ponytail. It hung over her shoulder like a frozen waterfall. Stark, defiant line of light in a world of gray dot. She did not check her watch. She did not pace. A forensic genealogist knows that time is not a master. It is a witness. She had spent a decade waiting for this moment. A few more minutes of silence were nothing but a prelude. The heavy, metallic growl of a high-performance engine echoed from the ramp. Headlights cut through the darkness. Two predatory beams of light that swept across the pillars before coming to a rest 10 feet from where she stood. A black SUV, armored, sleek, and smelling of fresh rain and desperate wealth. The door opened. Sterling Vane stepped out. He did not look like the man from the gala. His bespoke suit was damp. His hair was disheveled by the storm. And the arrogance that usually defined his posture had been replaced by a tense, twitching energy. He looked like a man who had been told his oxygen was about to be cut off. He didn't speak immediately. He leaned against the door of his vehicle, trying to find the right mask to wear. He looked at Dominique, scanning her for a weakness, for a glimmer of greed, for any sign that she was a woman who could be bought. He found nothing but a razor-sharp jawline and a gaze as cold as a mountain lake. Dominique, he finally said. His voice was gravelly, stripped of its polished boardroom charm. You've caused quite a stir today. My board is in a panic. The second at my throat. And my stock price is currently in the basement of hell. I hope you're proud of your little performance. Dominique did not move. She did not breathe. She simply watched him. Is that why you called me here, Sterling? She asked. Her voice was a low, vibrating frequency that seemed to hum against the concrete walls. To tell me that your empire is fragile. I already knew that. I'm the one who mapped the cracks. Vane walked toward her, his steps echoing, He stopped 3 feet away, just outside the circle of her personal space. He reached into his inner coat pocket and pulled out a leather checkbook, a small, slim object that held the power to change 1,000 lives. "Let's stop the games," he hissed. "I don't know who put you up to this. I don't know which competitor is paying you to dig through my family's trash. But I know how this works. Everyone has a number." He pulled out a silver pen. He didn't look at her while he wrote. He was focused on the paper, on the zero, on the illusion of his own control. $50 million, he said, tearing the check from the book with a sharp, violent snap. He held it out. The paper fluttered in the damp draft of the garage. "Take it. Go back to your archives. Buy yourself a private island. And tell the press that your report was based on a clerical error. It's over, Dominique. You've had your fun. Now take the win and disappear." Dominique looked down at the check. She didn't reach for it. She didn't even acknowledge the amount. Instead, her right hand rose. Her thumb found the silver dragon scale ring. She began to twist it. Click, click, click. The sound was tiny, but it cut through the silence like a gunshot. The intricate silver scales reflected the dim orange light of the garage, looking like the armor of a sleeping beast. "You still think this is about money, Sterling?" she said. Her voice was devoid of emotion. "That is your greatest failing. You think the world is a series of transactions? You think you can buy the ground because you have a pen. But you forgot one thing." She paused. The silence stretched, expanding until it felt heavy enough to crush the breath out of his lungs. "Ownership is not a feeling," she whispered. "It is a lineage." Dominique reached into the pocket of her midnight blue coat. She didn't pull out a check. She pulled out a high-resolution physical photograph. She held it up. Vane squinted, trying to see the image in the low light. It was a photo of a document. The paper in the image was yellowed, brittle, covered in the elegant, spidery cursive of the late 19th century. At the bottom was a wax seal, dark red, shaped like a crest that Vane had only ever seen in the oldest, most private corridors of the city hall. "Don't look closer, Sterling," Dominique commanded. Vane stepped forward. His eyes scanned the text. His breathing began to hitch. He saw the date, May 14th, 1884. He saw the name of the grantor. And he saw the name of the beneficiary. St. Clair. It wasn't just a deed. It was an original sovereign grant, a document signed before the city was incorporated, before the laws Vane used to protect himself were even written. The photograph showed a specific clause, circled in red forensic ink. The perpetuity clause. It stated that the land, the very ground beneath Vane Tower and the central utility grid, could never be transferred via corporate merger. It could only be held by a living heir of the St. Clair bloodline. Any attempt to occupy the land by an outside entity would trigger an immediate, automatic reversion of all structures to the original trust. Vane's hand began to shake. The check he was holding slipped from his fingers. It drifted to the oily floor, landing in a puddle of dirty water. $50 million. Reduced to wet paper. "This is a fake," he stammered. His voice was rising. "This is a forgery. My grandfather had the title cleared in the 50s. We have the papers." Dominique twisted the dragon scale ring again. A sharp, final click. "Your grandfather had a forgery cleared." Willing judge to bury the truth. But as a forensic genealogist, I don't look at what was buried. I look at what survived. She took a step toward him. For the first time, she let the weight of her presence push against him. This deed was never in the city archives. It was in a private vault in Switzerland, held in escrow for the day a St. Clair heir was strong enough to come back and claim it. She pointed to the photo, specifically to the seal. "That wax contains the DNA of my great-grandfather. I've already had it tested. I've already filed the motion for a writ of entry." Vane backed away. He hit the side of his SUV. The metal was cold, unyielding, just like the woman standing in front of him. "You can't do this," he whispered. "You'll destroy the city's infrastructure. You'll leave millions without power." Dominique's jaw set. "I won't leave them without power." She said, "I will simply be the one sending them the bill. A bill that you have been collecting for 50 years on land that was never yours." She lowered the photo. The platinum ponytail caught the light as she turned her head. "The litigation is already live. Sterling, the fiduciary duty you owe to your shareholders is now a liability. By tomorrow morning, you won't be the CEO of a utility giant. You will be the defendant in the largest asset seizure in the history of this country." She turned her back on him. Her movement was slow, graceful. "Absolute. Dominique," Vane screamed, his voice echoing through the empty garage. "I'll kill you. I'll burn that document. I'll erase you from the earth." Dominique stopped. She didn't look back. "You can't erase the truth, Sterling. It's in the soil. It's in the water. And now, it's in the hands of the rightful owner." She began to walk toward the exit. The sound of her boots on the concrete was steady, rhythmic, like a heart beating in the dark. Behind her, Sterling Vane fell to his knees. He reached for the check in the puddle, but his hands were too shaky to pick it up. He sat there in the silence of level B for a billionaire who had just realized that his entire life was a lease that had just been canceled. Dominique stepped out of the garage and into the rain. The storm was at its peak, but she didn't feel the cold. She touched the silver dragon scale. Ring, it felt warm. The private threat was over. Now it was time for the public execution, the headquarters of St. Clair Forensic. Genealogy was not an office. It was a cathedral of data, a silent, high-tech sanctuary where the past was meticulously reconstructed to dismantle the present. The air inside the lab was kept at a constant, crisp 68 degrees, perfect for the massive servers that hummed behind tempered glass, and perfect for the preservation of documents that were never meant to see the light of day. Dominique St. Clair stood before a wall of liquid crystal displays. Her silhouette was a study in absolute, unyielding power. The deep obsidian of her skin was highlighted by the cool blue light of a spinning DNA helix. Her platinum blonde ponytail fell down her back like a frozen stream, its metallic sheen contrasting sharply with the midnight silk of her turtleneck. She did not look tired. A forensic genealogist does not succumb to fatigue when the hunt is nearing its end. She looked refined, sharp, like a diamond that had been polished specifically to cut through glass. Dominique raised her right hand. Her thumb found the silver dragon scale ring. Click, click, click. The sound was the heartbeat of the room, a rhythmic, metallic pulse that signaled the transition from investigation to execution. She wasn't just looking at family trees anymore. She was looking at the structural integrity of a dynasty. On the primary screen, two lines were converging. One line represented the ancestral blood of the St. Clair family, a lineage that had been suppressed for a century. The other line represented the legal title to the valley where Sterling Vane's primary industrial complex stood. The match was absolute. 99.9%. Dominique leaned in, her razor-sharp jawline tightening as she reviewed the final certification from the International Court of Heritage. The infrastructure flip was no longer a theory. It was a reality in the world of the elite. Ownership is often an illusion managed by layers of paperwork. Sterling Vane believed he owned his factories because his name was on the gates. He believed he owned the turbines because he paid the property taxes. But Sterling was a student of modern corporate law. He was not a student of sovereign genealogy. Dominique had discovered that the land beneath the Vane industrial complex was held in a perpetual lineal trust, legal relic from the 1800s, that stipulated the ground could never be severed from the bloodline of the original grantee, the St. Clair bloodline, because Dominique had proven her direct descent through 3 generations of buried records. She had been legally confirmed as the sole successor trustee. In simple, brutal terms, Sterling Vane owned the buildings, but Dominique St. Clair owned the earth, and in the state of current statutory law, a building without a ground lease is nothing more than a giant, Expensive case of trespassing. Dominique felt a cold, calculating surge of triumph. She wasn't just taking his money. She was taking his foundation. She tapped a command on her console. A map of the city's industrial zone appeared, glowing in amber and crimson. The vein factories were highlighted in a pulsing red. They looked like organs in a body that was being rejected by its own skin. The internal monologue of a strategist is a quiet place. Dominique thought about the irony of Sterling's arrogance. He had spent billions upgrading his machinery. He had installed AI-driven assembly lines. He had fortified his walls with state-of-the-art security, but he had forgotten to check the soil. He had built a fortress on a grave, and now the grave was opening to reclaim its due. Dominique twisted the silver dragon scale ring again, a sharp, deliberate motion that felt like turning a key in a lock. She wasn't just a descendant. She was a fiduciary, and her duty was to the trust. Her duty was to ensure that the assets of the St. Clair family were no longer being exploited by an unauthorized occupant. She picked up a hard copy folder from her desk. It was heavy, filled with the weight of a century of stolen interest. Inside was the writ of immediate possession. This was a document that would bypass the standard court system. Because it was based on a sovereign land grant, it carried the authority of an asset. Seizure Dominic looked at the clock on the wall. A vintage analog piece with a steady, heavy tick, 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 in exactly 4 minutes. A digital courier would deliver the notice to every major bank holding Sterling Vane's debt. They would be informed that the collateral for their multi-billion-dollar loans, the factories, was sitting on land that Vane did not own. The banks would trigger their insecurity clauses. They would freeze his accounts within the hour. The credit lines that fueled his power grid would vanish. The infrastructure flip was the ultimate checkmate. Dominique walked to the window. The city below was a sprawling grid of lights. Each light represented a home, a business, a life that was currently powered by Sterling Vane's greed. She wasn't going to turn them off. Not yet. She was going to change the name on the bill. She felt the smooth, cold silver of the ring against her thumb. It was a tactile reminder of her ancestors, the ones who had been pushed off this land so that Vane's grandfather could build his first coal plant. They had been left with nothing but their names, but a name, when handled by a forensic genealogist, is more powerful than a fleet of tanks. Dominique watched as the countdown on her screen hit 0. The data was sent. The proof was undeniable. The bloodline had reclaimed the ground. She could almost feel the vibration in the earth, the imaginary sound of the ground shifting beneath the Vane factories, the sound of a billion-dollar empire realizing it had no place to stand. Sterling Vane would spend the night calling judges who could no longer help him. He would call politicians who would suddenly find their phones busy, because when the ground is stolen, there is no law that can keep the building standing. Dominique took a slow, deep breath. The scent of the sandalwood in her office felt richer, more intense. She was no longer just a shadow in the archives. She was the invisible architect who had just redesigned the city's power structure. She looked at the silver dragon scale ring. It caught a stray beam of blue light from the monitors. For a moment, the dragon seemed to move, its silver scales shimmering with a life of their own. The flip was complete. Dominique St. Clair sat back down in her leather chair. She didn't smile. A queen does not smile when the execution is simply a matter of paperwork. She simply watched the map, the red pulses around the vein. Factories began to turn white, the color of surrender, the color of the St. Clair family crest. She reached for her platinum pen. There were more documents to sign, more trusts to activate. The industrial complex was just the first piece. Sterling Vane had built a world of fire and steel. Dominique St. Clair was going to drown it in the cold, irrefutable truth of her own blood. The infrastructure flip was not just a legal maneuver. It was a homecoming. And the land, long neglected and silenced, seemed to hum in agreement under her feet. The hunt was over. The harvest had begun. The air inside the glass penthouse did not just feel cold. It felt surgical. Dominique St. Clair sat at her mahogany desk, a dark, polished expanse that seemed to absorb the dim light of the evening. Outside, the city was a sprawling tapestry of gold and neon. A million lives pulsing with electrical current. A current that Sterling Vane believed he owned. Dominique watched the clock. The heavy, brass hands moved with the weight of a guillotine. It was exactly 5:59 p.m. She reached out her right hand. Her thumb found the silver dragon scale ring. Click. 1. Rotation for the decades of overcharging. Click. 1. Rotation for the land stolen from her. Great-grandfather. Click. 1. Rotation for the arrogance of a man who thought he was a god because he controlled a switch. Dominique picked up her vintage platinum fountain pen. The sapphire on the cap caught the blue light of her monitors. It was a cold, sharp glint. She signed her name at the bottom of the sovereign injunction. The ink was dark, permanent. It was the signature of a woman who was no longer asking for justice. She was enforcing it. The digital copy of the cease and desist order was sent at the speed of light. It did not go to a receptionist. It went directly to the central control hubs of the city's power grid. Hubs that sat on land now legally recognized as St. Clair property. Under the law of sovereign deeds, an unauthorized occupant has no right to operate machinery on the owner's soil. To do so is a criminal trespass. Dominique was not just asking them to stop. She was legally paralyzing them. The impact was not a bang. It was a sigh. Dominique stood up and walked to her floor-to-ceiling window. Her obsidian skin looked like polished marble against the silver light of her hair. Her floor-length platinum ponytail trailed behind her, a silent, shimmering witness to the execution. She watched the northern horizon. The industrial district was the first to go, a massive sector of the city, usually glowing with the orange heat of the factories, suddenly vanished, swallowed by a creeping, absolute shadow. Then the financial district. The glowing skyscrapers that housed the world's largest banks were reduced to hollow, glass skeletons. The light didn't just fade. It was cut, precise, merciless. The silence that followed was heavy. It was the sound of an entire city holding its breath. For the first time in a century, the hum of the Vane Empire had ceased. Dominique twisted the silver dragon scale ring. The sensation of the cold metal against her skin was the only thing she needed. She was not afraid of the dark. She had been born in it 5 miles away. In the executive boardroom of Vane Industries, the atmosphere was not silent. It was a riot of panicked voices and frantic movement. Sterling Vane stood at the head of the long, ebony table. The emergency lights had kicked in, casting a sickly, red glow over the room. It made the directors look like ghosts trapped in a nightmare. The stock ticker on the wall had stopped, frozen at a price that represented the total destruction of their personal fortunes. Sterling was screaming. His face was a mask of purple rage. He was slamming his fists onto the table, demanding that the power be restored. "Call the governor." He roared. "Call the National Guard. I don't care what it takes. Turn the lights back on at the other end of the table." Marcus Thorne, the lead counsel, sat perfectly still. His tablet was glowing with the text of the injunction. He wasn't looking at Sterling. He was looking at his own hands. They were shaking. "We can't." "Sterling," Marcus said. His voice was a dry whisper that cut through Sterling's rage. The billionaire turned on him, his eyes wide and bloodshot. "What do you mean we can't?" "I pay you $30 million a year to tell me how we can." Marcus looked up. The red light made him look ancient. "The injunction is not from a local court. It's based on a sovereign land grant. It has been validated by the Heritage Tribunal. By law, any technician who touches that switch is personally liable for a felony trespass. The union has already pulled every worker from the floor. They won't risk prison for a company that doesn't own the ground it stands on." The room went silent. The directors, Men and women who had spent their lives protecting their own interests, suddenly looked at Sterling as if he were a leper. The board of directors of Vane Industries was a group of predators. They only followed a leader as long as the leader provided the kill. Now, the leader had become the liability. Director Holloway, a woman known for her coldness in a merger, leaned forward. Sterling, she said. Her voice was like ice. Our fiduciary duty is to the shareholders, not to your ego. The St. Clair Trust has offered a path to restoration, but it requires your immediate resignation and the forfeiture of your personal shares to cover the back rent on the land. Sterling gasped. He looked around the table, searching for a single face that showed loyalty. He found nothing. Every director was looking at their phone. They were already receiving the settlement offers from Demonic's firm. She was offering them a way out, a way to avoid being sued for the 50 years of illegal occupancy. The price of their safety was Sterling Vane's head. You can't do this, Sterling whispered. I built this. I am Vane Industries. No. Director Holloway replied. You are a tenant who stopped paying the rent 100 years ago, and we are not going to jail with you. She stood up. The other directors followed, one by one. They turned their backs on the man who had been their king. They walked out of the red-lit room, leaving Sterling Vane alone in the hollow heart of his empire. Dominique St. Clair watched the boardroom from her monitors. She saw the directors leaving. She saw Sterling collapse into his chair, a broken shell of a man. She felt the rhythmic click of the silver dragon scale ring against her thumb. The shutdown was complete. But it wasn't just about the electricity. It was about the power. Sterling Vane had spent his life believing that power came from the grid. He didn't understand that true power comes from the truth. Dominique stood at the window, looking out at the dark city. It was beautiful, in the absence of the artificial glare. She could see the stars. They were bright, constant. The city would have power again soon. But it would not be Sterling's power. It would be hers. She thought about her grandmother, who had died in a cold apartment because she couldn't afford the Vane utility bills. She thought about the millions of people who had been taxed and squeezed to fund Sterling's gala. The debt was being paid. Dominique reached up and adjusted her platinum ponytail. Her movements were calm, precise. She was the invisible architect, and she had just redrawn the map of the world. The city was dark, but for Dominique St. Clair, everything had never been clearer. She took her seat at the mahogany desk once more. The blue light of the monitors reflected in the silver dragon scale ring. The board had turned. The lights were out. The king was alone now. It was time for the final audit. She felt the cool, smooth surface of her platinum pen. There was one more document to sign. The asset seizure of Sterling Vane's personal estate. The hunt was almost over, and the darkness was the perfect place to finish. It dot the shadows in Sterling Vane's private sanctuary were not like the shadows in the rest of the city. Here, in the inner sanctum of the Vane estate, the darkness felt thick, heavy. It tasted of old paper, expensive scotch, and the cold, metallic scent of a panic that has no exit. The only light came from the fireplace, where the last embers of a dying fire cast a flickering, blood-red glow over the mahogany bookshelves. Sterling sat behind his massive desk, a fortress of carved oak that suddenly felt like a casket. The silence was absolute, save for the steady, rhythmic ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner. Tick, dot, tick, dot, tick. Every second was a heartbeat of his empire dying. He reached for the crystal decanter, his hand shaking so violently that the glass clattered against the rim. He had spent 50 years building a wall of lawyers and offshore accounts. He believed he was invisible. He believed he was untouchable. Then, the door to the study opened. Dominique St. Clair did not knock. She did not ask for permission. She stepped into the room with the quiet, lethal grace of a shadow reclaiming its space. Her deep obsidian skin was flawless, a dark mirror that seemed to absorb the dim light of the embers. Her platinum blonde ponytail hung down her back, a sharp, electric line of white that looked like a lightning strike frozen in time. She was dressed in a tailored charcoal wool coat that screamed of elite, unreachable status. She stopped in front of his desk. She didn't look like a researcher. She looked like the manifestation of a debt that had finally come due. Sterling looked up. His eyes were bloodshot. The arrogance had been stripped away, leaving only the raw, ugly desperation of a cornered animal. "What more do you want?" Dominique, he hissed. His voice was a dry rattle. "You've taken the stock. You've taken the land. You've turned my own board against me. Is it not enough?" Dominique did not answer immediately. She reached up with her right hand. Her thumb found the silver dragon scale ring. The light from the fire caught the intricate metalwork. The silver scales seemed to ripple, shimmering with a cold, internal fire. She began to twist it. Click, 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 click. The sound was tiny, but in the silence of the room, it carried the weight of a judge's gavel. "I don't want your money, Sterling," she said. Her voice was low, like the hum of a distant storm. "I don't even want your buildings. I want the truth you buried in the foundations." She reached into her coat and pulled out a sleek, black tablet. She tapped the screen and slid it across the mahogany surface toward him. Vane looked down. His breath hitched. On the screen was a forensic ledger. It wasn't a standard accounting sheet. It was a map of a digital ghost world. It showed a series of offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands, Luxembourg, and the Isle of Man. But these weren't just Vane Industries accounts. They were sub-accounts. Every single one of them was tied to the St. Clair Ancestral Trust. Sterling felt the blood drain from his face. His heart began to hammer against his ribs like a trapped bird. "You thought the trust was a dead end," Dominique said. Her eyes locked on to his. "You thought that because it was dormant. It was a safe place to hide the overflow. For 30 years. You've been using my family's tax identification numbers to move illegal capital. You've been laundering the city's utility surcharges through a ghost trust. You didn't think anyone would ever claim?" Vane tried to speak, but his throat was too tight. He had spent decades layering his funds, moving money through so many shell companies that it became untraceable to the IRS. But he had made one fatal, arrogant mistake. He had used the St. Clair Trust as the ultimate integration point. He believed that since the heirs were gone, the trust was a black hole where money could go in and come out clean. He didn't realize the black hole had eyes. Dominique twisted the silver dragon scale ring again. The sharp edges of the silver scales felt like a tactile confirmation of his guilt. "You committed the ultimate sin of a fiduciary, Sterling. You used a beneficiary's assets to facilitate your own criminal enterprise. That isn't just a corporate error. That is a RICO violation." Dominique leaned over the desk. Her face was inches from his. He could smell the sandalwood and the cold rain that still clung to her coat. "I am the trustee. Sterling, that means I have full visibility into every transaction made in that trust's name for the last century. I didn't just find my grandfather's name. I found your ledger. I found the $16 billion you moved to avoid the federal infrastructure taxes." Vane's eyes darted to the door. He was thinking about the shredder. He was thinking about the fire. "It's too late, Sterling," Dominique said. Her voice was a whisper of absolute destruction. "The final audit is already complete. I didn't just send the data to the SEC. I sent it to the Department of Justice. As if on cue. A new sound broke the silence of the estate. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't the rain. It was the low, wailing siren of multiple high-performance vehicles approaching the gates. The blue and red lights began to dance across the mahogany walls. Slicing through the darkness of the study, Dominique stood up. Straightening her coat, her platinum ponytail caught the flash of the sirens, shimmering like a beacon of justice. Sterling sat frozen. He looked at the tablet. He looked at the ring on Dominique's thumb. He realized that the woman standing in front of him wasn't just an heir. She was a forensic executioner. The sound of tires screeching on the wet gravel echoed through the room. Then the heavy thud of boots on the porch. The front doors of the Vane estate were not opened. They were breached. Dominique watched him. She saw the moment the last spark of light left his eyes. The moment he realized that his towers, his money, and his name were all gone. The silver dragon scale ring clicked. One final time. "Checkmate, Sterling," she said. The doors to the study burst open. 5 agents in tactical gear, their windbreakers emblazoned with the bold yellow letters, FBI. They didn't look at Dominique. They knew who she was. She was the one who had provided the encryption keys. She was the one who had mapped the crime. Sterling Vane. The lead agent announced. His voice was hard level. "You are under arrest for money laundering, racketeering, and massive tax evasion." Vane didn't move. He didn't resist. He sat there while the agents pulled him from his chair. The crystal decanter fell, shattering on the floor. The scotch spilled out, soaking into the ancient Persian rug, a golden stain that looked like a dying empire. Dominique stood in the center of the room, a pillar of calm in the middle of the chaos. She watched as they handcuffed the man who had thought he was too big to fail. As they led him toward the door, Vane stopped. He looked back at her. His face was a mask of pure, unadulterated hatred. "You'll never keep it," he spat. "The city will tear you apart." Dominique didn't flinch. She simply touched the silver dragon scale ring on her thumb. "The city doesn't need to love me, Sterling," she said. Her voice was steady. "It just needs to pay its rent. And as of tonight, I'm the only landlord in town." The agents dragged him out. The room fell silent again, except for the blue and red lights still pulsing against the walls. Dominique looked at the empty desk. She looked at the fire, which was now nothing but cold. Gray ash. She was alone in the heart of the Vane estate. She reached down and picked up the tablet. The forensic ledger was still there. 1,000,000 lines of evidence, 100 years of stolen history, all rectified in a single hour. She walked to the window. The rain was finally stopping. The clouds were breaking, allowing a sliver of pale moonlight to hit the wet pavement below. The final audit was over. The villain was in chains. But Dominique St. Clair knew that a vacuum of power is never empty for long. She felt the heavy weight of the signature item against her skin. It was no longer a symbol of revenge. It was a symbol of governance. She was no longer the forensic genealogist looking for a family. She was the matriarch who had found an empire. She took a deep breath. The scent of the sandalwood was gone, replaced by the clean, sharp smell of a new beginning. She walked out of the study, her boots echoing through the hollow halls of the Vane estate. The lights were still out in the city, but Dominique St. Clair could see everything. The audit was done. The truth was out now. It was time to sign the new laws of the city. The holding room was a box of reinforced concrete and cold, unforgiving fluorescent light. It smelled of industrial bleach, old sweat, and the sharp, ozonic scent of a storm that had finally broken. Outside, the rain had slowed to a rhythmic dripping against the high, barred windows. But inside, the silence was heavier than the stone walls. Sterling Vane sat at a bolted metal table. His hands were cuffed to a steel rail. The bespoke silk of his sleeves was stained with the gray dust of the precinct. His face was a map of exhaustion. The deep, arrogant lines of his brow had collapsed into a mess of twitching nerves. He was a man who had spent 60 years believing he was the sun, only to realize he was a moth caught in a jar. The heavy steel door groaned as it opened. Dominique St. Clair stepped into the room. She did not look like she had been awake for 48 hours. She did not look like a woman who had just dismantled a global utility empire. She looked like a vision of absolute, untouchable power. Her deep obsidian skin was a flawless contrast to the harsh white light. Her floor-length platinum blonde ponytail was coiled neatly over her left shoulder, looking like a silken rope of silver fire. She carried a single, slim leather portfolio under her arm. Her movements were fluid, precise. She didn't look at the guards. She didn't look at the cameras. She looked only at the broken man in the chair. She sat down across from him. The metal chair did not scrape. She lowered herself with a grace that made the room feel like a throne room. Sterling looked up. His eyes were red. Hollow. You come to watch the execution. Dominique, he asked. His voice was a dry rattle. You come to see the great Sterling Vane in chains. Dominique did not answer immediately. She placed the leather portfolio on the table. Her right hand rose. Her thumb found the silver dragon scale. Ring, click, click, click. The sound was the only rhythm in the room. A cold, metallic heartbeat. The silver scales caught the fluorescent glare, reflecting jagged shards of light into Vane's eyes. I didn't come for the theater, Sterling, she said. Her voice was a low, resonant frequency that seemed to vibrate the very metal of the table. I came for the ledger. She opened the portfolio. Inside was a document printed on heavy, cream-colored bond paper. It bore the seal of the St. Clair Ancestral Trust and the watermark of the federal asset. Forfeiture Division. This is a general release and voluntary transfer of assets, she said, her eyes locked onto his. You are currently facing 42 counts of money laundering, 30 counts of title fraud, and a RICO indictment that will ensure you die in a federal cell. The government is already preparing to seize your corporate holdings. She leaned forward, her razor-sharp jawline catching the light. But your personal estate, Sterling, the penthouses in London, the villa in Tuscany, the private art collection, the hidden accounts in Singapore, those are currently protected by a complex web of offshore trusts. It would take the government 20 years to untangle them. Vane's eyes flickered with a tiny, pathetic spark of hope. So you can't touch them, he whispered. I still have my life. Dominique twisted the silver dragon scale ring. A sharp, decisive motion. You are lying to yourself, Sterling, she said. And that is the most expensive mistake you can make. She tapped the document. I am offering you a pardon of debt. In my capacity as the sole trustee of the St. Clair grant, I have the legal authority to withdraw the private litigation regarding the back rent and land dues violations. If I withdraw, the federal government loses its primary witness. The RICO case collapses into a series of minor tax disputes. You walk out of here in 5 years. Not 50. Vane's breath hitched. What's the catch? Dominique's gaze was ice. You sign over everything. Not just the company, everything. Your homes, your cars, your grandfather's watch. Every cent of the $16 billion you laundered through my family's name. You leave this room with the clothes on your back and the name your grandfather stole. Nothing else. The room felt like it was losing oxygen. Sterling Vane looked at the paper, then at the woman who was holding his life in her hands. He thought about the silk sheets, the private jets. The feeling of looking down at a city and knowing he owned the air. To sign this was to commit suicide. To refuse was to rot in a cage. Dominique watched the calculation behind his eyes. She felt the pulse in her thumb against the silver ring. She wasn't guessing. She knew his price. A man like Sterling Vane doesn't fear poverty as much as he fears the loss of his legacy. But she had already taken the legacy. Now she was just cleaning the house. He reached for the pen. His hand was shaking so badly he had to grip the table with his other hand to steady it. You're a monster. He whispered. No, Sterling, Dominique replied. Her voice was like a velvet glove over a steel fist. I'm a genealogist. I'm just putting things back where they belong. She slid her vintage platinum fountain pen across the table. The sapphire on the cap glowed like a cold eye. Vane gripped the pen. He looked at the signature line. Below it, the text stated, I, Sterling Vane, hereby acknowledge that all personal and real property held in my name was acquired through the unauthorized exploitation of the St. Clair ancestral estate. It was a confession. It was a surrender. It was the sound of a 100-year-old lie. Finally, gasping its last breath, he signed. The sound of the nib on the heavy paper was a sharp, grating scratch. To Sterling, it sounded like a bone breaking. To Dominique, it sounded like a symphony. He dropped the pen. It rolled across the table, stopping when it hit the leather portfolio there. He spat. You have it all. You have the gold. You have the houses. Are you happy now? Dominique St. Clair did not smile. She stood up, taking the document and placing it back into the portfolio. She adjusted her platinum ponytail. Feeling the weight of the moment settle in her bones, happiness has nothing to do with it, Sterling, she said. Her voice was calm. Absolute. This is about fiduciary duty. The accounts are now balanced. She turned toward the door. Wait, Vane shouted. The pardon. When do I get out? Dominique stopped. She didn't look back. Her thumb twisted the silver dragon scale ring. One last time, the pardon applies to the St. Clair litigation. Sterling, she said. But I believe the IRS still has some questions about your 2024 filings. You'll be hearing from them in the morning. The door opened. Dominique stepped out into the hallway, leaving the villain in the shadows of the concrete box. She walked toward the exit of the facility. Each step was a beat of a new era. The signature of ruin was dry. The transfer was complete. Dominique St. Clair felt the cold. Morning air hit her face as she stepped outside. The sun was just beginning to rise, casting a long, purple shadow across the pavement. She was now the owner of the city's heart, the owner of the factories, and the owner of the Vane family's personal history. She touched the silver ring on her thumb. It was no longer a weapon. It was a seal. The man who thought he was too big to fail was now a footnote in her archives. Dominique looked at her car, a sleek black sedan waiting for her at the curb. She wasn't going to her penthouse. She was going to the city archives. There were more names on her. List. More legacies to reclaim. The audit of the world had only just begun, and Dominique St. Clair had a very long memory. She sat in the back of the car. The silence was luxurious. The victory was absolute. She opened her portfolio and looked at the signature one last time. It was messy, frantic, the mark of a man who had lost everything. She closed the folder. Drive. She said to the chauffeur, "We have work to do." The office was a tomb of glass and cold, unforgiving steel. Outside, the city lay in a state of breathless suspension. A million lights were beginning to flicker back to life. But they were no longer powered by the Vane legacy. They were fueled by the St. Clair restoration. The air inside the room was heavy. It carried the scent of old ink, distilled sandalwood, and the sharp, metallic temps of a final, irreversible defeat. Dominique St. Clair sat perfectly still. She was a silhouette of absolute, obsidian power. Her deep skin seemed to absorb the dim light, making her look like an ancient deity carved from the night itself. Her floor-length platinum blonde ponytail rested against the charcoal fabric of her coat, a stark, electric line of silver that shimmered with every shallow breath the villain took. Across from her, Sterling Vane was a ghost of the man he had been 48 hours ago. His bespoke suit was wrinkled. His eyes were hollowed out by a terror that money could not buy his way out of. He looked at the documents laid out on the mahogany desk. They were not just papers. They were the blueprints for his erasure, the final asset transfer and sovereign release. Dominique watched him. Her gaze was not one of anger. Anger is a hot, messy emotion. Her gaze was forensic, cold, analytical. She was watching the final collapse of a structure she had spent a decade undermining. She could see the pulse jumping in his neck, a frantic, trapped rhythm. She could see the sweat beading on his upper lip. Even in the air-conditioned chill of the penthouse, her right hand rested on the edge of the desk. Her thumb found the silver dragon scale ring. Click. 1. Rotation for the silence of the archives. Click. 1. Rotation for the weight of the stolen years. Click. 1. Rotation for the moment the lie finally died. The sound of the ring was the only thing that filled the vacuum of the room. It was a rhythmic, metallic reminder that time had run out. Sterling Vane looked at the ring. His eyes darted to the silver scales, then back to Dominique's face. He was looking for mercy. He found only the razor-sharp jawline of a woman who had been forged in the shadows of his own greed. "Sign it, Sterling," she said. Her voice was a low, vibrating frequency. It didn't carry the heat of a threat. It carried the gravity of a physical law. Every second you hesitate, I release another offshore ledger to the Treasury. Every breath you take in this room is a debt you cannot afford to pay. Vane reached for the pen. His fingers were pale, bloodless. He gripped the heavy, platinum instrument as if it were a dagger. But he was not a warrior. He was a tenant who had been caught in a century-long trespass. His hand was trembling, a fine, persistent shake that made the pen rattle against the paper. The sound was pathetic, a tiny, scratching noise in a room built for empires. He looked at the first page. The ground lease reversionary clause. It stated that, because the land had been acquired through a fraudulent eminent domain action in 1924, every structure built upon it was legally considered an unlawful improvement. The sovereign deed protocols, those improvements, the towers, the factories, the grid now reverted to the rightful owner of the soil, Dominique St. Clair. He turned to the second page. The fiduciary breach forfeiture. Coes? He had laundered capital through the St. Clair Trust. His personal estate was now legally categorized as commingled criminal assets. To avoid a life sentence in a federal penitentiary, he had to voluntarily sign over the keys to his world. The villa in Tuscany, the penthouse in Manhattan, the private islands, the secret accounts in Zurich. All of it signed, Dominique whispered. Her voice was like the wind through a graveyard. Short, sharp, final. Vane's eyes filled with a weak, saline moisture. He looked at the signature line. For 60 years, that signature had moved markets. It had started wars. It had built cities. Now it was going to sign his death warrant as a public figure. He lowered the pen. The nib touched the paper. A small, dark pool of ink began to spread. Like a black hole devouring the page, he began to write. The S was jagged. The T was a frantic line. The R was a messy, collapsing curve. He was signing away the air he breathed. He was signing away the name his grandfather had stolen from the earth. As he finished the final letter, the pen slipped from his fingers. It rolled across the mahogany, stopping only when it hit the base of the silver dragon scale ring. Vane let out a ragged, sobbing breath. He slumped back into the leather chair, a broken shell of a man. I did it, he gasped. You have it all. You have the money. You have the power. You have the city. Are you satisfied? Dominique did not answer. She stood up. Her movement was slow, fluid, like a shadow lengthening at sunset. She picked up the document. Her eyes scanned the signature. It was messy. It was desperate. It was perfect. She reached down and picked up the pen. It was a beautiful object. Platinum, heavy, engraved with the Vane family crest. A symbol of institutional dominance. She looked at Sterling Vane. He was watching her, hoping for a nod. Hoping for some shred of acknowledgement that he had once been a king. Dominique adjusted the ring on her thumb. The light from the city caught the silver scales, creating a shimmering, dragon-like glow. She looked at the pen, then back at the man who had built a world on a lie. She gripped the pen with both hands. Snap. The sound was sharp, final, like a bone breaking in the middle of a silent night. The platinum barrel splintered. The sapphire cap fell to the floor. A drop of dark blue ink splattered onto the white cuff of Sterling's sleeve. Vane flinched. He looked at the broken pieces of the pen as if she had snapped his own spine. Dominique tossed the fragments onto the desk. They clattered with a hollow, plastic sound. You were never the king, Sterling, she said. Her voice was a low, resonant hum. It carried the weight of every ancestor who had been erased to build this tower. You were just the tenant. And I'm not just the landlord. I'm the audit you couldn't survive. She leaned over the desk. Her face was inches from his. He could see the absolute, unfiltered truth in her eyes. There was no joy there, only the cold, professional satisfaction of a job finished. Your grandfather stole the land, she whispered. You stole the power, but I reclaimed the soul. You leave this room with nothing but the clothes on your back. And if I ever see your name on a legal filing again, I will release the rest of the ledger. Vane couldn't speak. He could only stare at the broken pen. He realized then that he hadn't just lost his company. He had been erased. Dominique straightened her coat. She picked up the signed portfolio. Her floor-length platinum ponytail whipped behind her as she turned. She walked toward the heavy oak doors. She didn't look back. A matriarch does not look at the ruins. She only looks at the new foundation. She felt the rhythmic click of the silver dragon scale ring as she reached the exit. Each scale felt like a tactile confirmation of her victory. The city was waiting for her. The grid was waiting for her. The archives were waiting for her. She stepped out of the penthouse. The elevator doors closed with a soft, muffled thud, separating her from the wreckage of the Vane dynasty. As the elevator descended, Dominique looked at her reflection in the polished gold of the interior. She saw the razor-sharp jawline, the deep obsidian skin, the silver hair. She was no longer the forensic genealogist digging in the dirt. She was the sovereign dot. The checkmate was complete. But for Dominique St. Clair, the game was only just beginning. There were other towers in this city, other names built on stolen ground, other kings who believed they were too big to fail. She touched the ring on her thumb. She had the pen. She had the deed. And she had the memory of everyone they had tried to forget. The city lights were glowing bright now. A million gold eyes watching the dawn of a new era. Dominique stepped out into the lobby. The guards, once loyal to Vane, bowed their heads as she passed. They knew the shift in the wind. They knew who held the lease. She walked into the cool morning air. The rain had finally stopped. The world felt clean, new. The tenant was gone. The matriarch was home. The morning did not arrive with a fanfare. It arrived with a slow, silver-gray light that bled across the horizon like a cold, healing balm. The sky was the color of weathered steel, matching the vast, industrial landscape that stretched out before Dominique St. Clair. The air was sharp, bracing. It carried the scent of wet iron, cooling concrete, and the first clean breath of a city that had been released from a century of atmospheric debt. Dominique stood on the elevated observation deck of the primary substation. Her deep obsidian skin was a masterpiece of contrast against the pale light of the dawn. She looked like a statue of ancient justice, carved from the very bedrock of the earth she now legally commanded. Her floor-length platinum blonde ponytail whipped in the morning breeze, a bright, electric banner of silver that signaled the change. In ownership to everyone watching from the streets below, she did not feel the cold. A forensic genealogist is fueled by the heat of a completed audit. She felt the heavy, rhythmic vibration of the massive turbines beneath her feet. They were still spinning. They were still providing the lifeblood of the city. But the vibration felt different now. It no longer felt like the frantic, exploitative thrum of Vane Industries. It felt like a steady, purposeful heartbeat, directly in front of her, suspended by 3 massive industrial cranes. Was the sign for 50 years. Those 6-foot-tall letters had spelled out the name of a thief, Vane. It had been a brand of dominance, a golden monument to a family that believed they could own the rain and the wind. Now, those letters were being lowered into the darkness of a salvage truck. They were nothing but scrap metal, hollow, corroded, and irrelevant in their place. A new sequence of letters was being hoisted into the sky. They were not made of gold. They were made of brushed, aerospace-grade titanium. They were designed to last for 1,000 years. They were designed to survive the storms that Sterling Vane had ignored. Odessa Street, Clare Heritage. Dominique watched as the final bolt was secured. The name of her grandmother now sat at the highest point of the city's infrastructure. It was not just a tribute. It was a correction of the record. Odessa St. Clair had spent her life working in the shadows of these very chimneys. She had been a ghost in the machine, a woman whose labor had been extracted and whose name had been erased to fund Sterling Vane's private jets. Don't now. The machine belonged to her bloodline. Dominique reached up with her right hand. Her thumb found the silver dragon scale ring. Click. 1. Rotation for the grandmother who died in the cold. Click. 1. Rotation for the records that were burned to hide the truth. Click. 1. Rotation for the sovereign. Dawn, the sound of the ring was a tactile anchor, a reminder that while the name on the building had changed, the work was far from over. This was not the end of a story. It was the activation of a new, global protocol. Dominique's internal monologue was a focused stream of legal and financial data. She wasn't just thinking about the past. She was calculating the future. Under the sovereign deed she had activated, this facility was no longer a for-profit corporation. It was a public heritage trust. By restructuring the utility as a trust, she had eliminated the need for shareholder dividends. She had bypassed the corporate tax loopholes that Sterling had used to drain the city dry. The revenue would now be diverted into a reparative infrastructure fund, lowering costs for the disenfranchised, upgrading the pipes in the neighborhoods Vane had neglected. This was the ultimate institutional revenge. She hadn't just taken his company. She had transformed it into a weapon of equity. Dominique looked down at the courtyard below. A group of former Vane executives were standing by the gates. They looked small, shivering in their expensive wool coats. They were waiting for their final severance packages. Packages that Dominique had personally audited. They would receive exactly what the law required, and not a cent more. Their era of management fees and executive bonuses was a ghost. She turned her gaze toward the city. The skyscrapers were beginning to catch the first rays of the sun. They looked like glass needles stitching the earth to the sky. Dominique knew that behind those glass walls, other dynasties were watching. They were sitting in their boardrooms, their hands shaking as they reviewed their own land titles. They were calling their genealogists, their historians, their lawyers. They were realizing that the rules of the game had changed overnight. The Matriarch will was no longer a rumor. It was a precedent. Dominique adjusted the silver dragon scale ring. The light of the rising sun hit the intricate silver, making it look as if the dragon was breathing white fire. She felt a deep, bone-level satisfaction, the kind of peace that only comes when the accounts are perfectly, irrefutably balanced. She thought about the next dynasty on her list, the Thorne family. They controlled the shipping lanes and the maritime insurance. They believed their wealth was protected by centuries of offshore layering. They believed they were too far out at sea for a forensic genealogist to find them. Dominique's jawline set into a hard, geometric line of intent. They were wrong. No one is too far. No one is too big. No one is too old. Every fortune has a root, and every route has a story. Dominique St. Clair was the one who read the stories that others tried to burn. She took a final breath of the cold, morning air. The scent of the lilies from the gala was a distant memory. The scent of the sandalwood from her penthouse was a world away. Here, in the shadow of the St. Clair Heritage Hub, there was only the scent of progress. She turned away from the observation deck. Her platinum ponytail whipped behind her, a silver streak against the industrial gray. Her boots clicked against the steel grating, a steady, rhythmic sound that matched the pulse of the city she now protected. As she reached the elevator, she paused. She looked back at the new sign, Odessa Street, Claire. The name glowed in the morning light. It was no longer a secret. It was a law. Dominique entered the elevator. The doors closed with a heavy, final sound, separating her from the dawn and returning her to the shadows of the archives. She had a new file to open, a new trust to investigate, a new corrupt dynasty to audit. Sterling Vane was the first, but he would not be the last. The city was waking up. The lights were on, and the Matriarch was watching. She touched the silver dragon scale. Ring one last time. The audit of the world was just beginning, and Dominique St. Clair had all the time in the time. If they sat in the time in the tie, if you're using like a scanner app, and if you're using like a scanner app, and it's like look at this, and like look at this, and we like a using path, and we all know I've been exploring that. We see CID when we see Angadi as I see a K-double AGA. We see where you see if you watch you see with con y guy con with comat dot wad with con with their side con with I can you decide to kai to see you to can kai to can I you we to guy can wick can you to you guy to can I world. The elevator descended, moving her away from the height of her victory and toward the depth of her next move. The sovereign dawn was complete, but for the corrupt. The night was just starting. Dominique looked at her reflection in the elevator's polished panel. She didn't smile. She didn't need to. She was the truth, and the truth never loses. The doors opened at the ground level. She stepped out into the world she had reclaimed. Drive. She whispered as she entered her car.